Hey everyone, I want this presentation to serve as a basic framework for which you can better understand what makes a coordination easier or harder, and then some different patterns that you can identify that might help you in learning coordinations. In most research, coordination is tested by finger tapping or circling your arms, and certainly do not reflect the type of tasks that you're seeing become widely popular in movement culture. However, let's not forget that coordination underlies all of our movements and also relations between people. When we're talking about coordination or movement, essentially we are talking about how time relates to space. So at what speed and rhythm were you moving, and then what space did you occupy while you were moving? As I'm sure that you've already found out from your own practice, a tight temporal relationship between limbs is much easier to coordinate than different temporal organizations. Also, there's a tendency for our bodies to have the hands produce similar patterns, and uncoupling this takes practice. An interesting example of uncoupling in the research is a study where participants were asked to tap the rhythm of one nursery rhyme while simultaneously humming the rhythm of a different nursery rhyme. Give this a try. Try to tap the rhythm of Row, Row, Row Your Boat while humming the rhythm of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And I'm sorry for my friends who are outside of the United States if these nursery rhymes do not apply to you or you don't know what they are. Perhaps you can use something that's more relevant to your culture. Out of the 100 participants in this study, how many people do you think could do this? 0. This is a good example illustrating that any movements that are uncoupled and the more asynchronous that they are, the harder the coordination is going to be. More interestingly, researchers have found that when you cross your midline with your limbs, this is harder to coordinate. In theory, the hardest coordination that you could do would be one where your limbs are moving in different directions, in different timings, while crossing your midline. By being aware of the different constraints that you can manipulate in a coordinative task, you can better come up with variations and progressions that best serve you and or your clientele. Also, when it comes to learning coordination tasks, it's good to be able to identify different movement patterns. I apologize if this is redundant, but a unilateral pattern would be one where each limb has distinct positions relative to one another. A good example would be a lunge, where both legs obviously have different positions and are doing different jobs relative to one another. A bilateral pattern would be one that is symmetrical with the limbs. This would be like your regular two-legged squat, where both legs are doing relatively the same amount of work at the same time. An ipsilateral pattern is where same-side limbs move in pairs. A good example of this would be throwing a jab in boxing, or if you can imagine a fencer who has their sword in their lead hand and they're lunging out with their lead leg and lead hand at the same time to try to touch their opponent with their sword. A contralateral pattern is one where diagonal limbs move in pairs. This can be found in walking or running. Now I'm going to show some basic coordination patterns that illustrate these things. These are patterns taken from fighting monkey practice. I'm using them because I think the group is most interested in learning fighting monkey coordinations. And I want to give the people what they want. Take note that these are a base layer pattern, and if you dive into internet land, you can find many different variations based off of these. If you are trying to be nice and want people to learn this and not go through the aggravating learning process, which is a good thing in and of itself, but let's say you just want someone to learn the pattern. First here, notice that I'm just starting with the arms, and I'm basically just moving pretty much one arm at a time, making it very easy to realize what positions need to be hit. Now I start moving into a unilateral pattern with the legs, and notice that it is a contralateral pattern in that I am turning my left shoulder here towards my right leg, making that a diagonal limb pair. I cannot tell you how many times and hundreds of people that I've seen in workshops be exposed to this pattern that don't recognize that it's contralateral, and they end up using an ipsilateral pattern, and it throws them off for the entire workshop. Because as you know, in these workshops, the teacher is not explicitly telling you what to do, and therefore, if you cannot observe the pattern correctly, no one is really going to help you pick it up. In this next video, what I'm showing is a more complex pattern of that first coordination, and this is just for all my OMU friends who want to learn more Fighting Monkey coordinations. Enjoy. Now, in this next video, there's a lot going on. Please bear with me. Notice that I'm starting in a bilateral stance, and I first am moving my limbs fairly coupled, same direction, same time, and then notice I'm taking the leg there to a unilateral stance. This is where it gets difficult though. Now I move the arms in different directions while crossing the body, and this presents a lot of challenges to people. So that first one where the limbs are moving in the same direction at the same time, no problem. People will be able to pick this up in no time. But when you start moving the limbs in opposite directions at the same time while crossing the midline, it becomes a lot more challenging. And even though the patterns look fairly similar, you'd be surprised. And I challenge you to learn this coordination pattern, or both of them right here in this video, and then try to teach them to a group of people and see what happens when you try to transition from that point to moving the limbs in the same direction at the same time to opposite directions while crossing the body. It's very interesting. This last slide shows a diagram of the psychological processes and physical forces that go into task-oriented training and learning movement patterns. The book that I'm referencing, Motor Control and Learning, is an amazing resource. It goes over everything you could imagine from learning coordination, motor control, task-oriented training, constraints-based learning, consolidates all the research in an unbiased fashion. It's not a cheap book, but it's well worth it if you're really looking to understand more about these things. In closing, I'd like to emphasize that coordination is happening all the time in all of the movements that we do and also between people. It is not limited to these coordination patterns that we are practicing in this unit. These coordination patterns are useful in that they combine a lot of great things. They combine having to learn new movement patterns. They combine moving your joints through a bunch of different ranges of motion. They also have plyometrics in them. It's a low-level aerobic, or it could also be an anaerobic activity. So what makes them so powerful is the combination of things that they're bringing together. And while these types of coordinative tasks may be fun to learn and very complex, I don't want them to overshadow the fact that you are coordinating when you get up and down from the floor or when you are walking. And there's something to be said to bring some attention to those movements.